We've worked with NDI actually in Moldova and with Andre and as he said, they're trying to get to the point where a party can survive losing elections and have consistency. I come from a country where the parties never die and they always are back, and it's always the same two, no matter how well or poorly they did. But they nevertheless are very competitive and have to pay a lot of attention to polling. And as you heard on the last panel, there's certainly some things that need to be improved in polling. And I was asked last minute to join this panel. I'm going to be on another one later today to talk about the future of polling. But so I don't have a set of slides or findings to show you for this one, as I was just asked to fill in. But do have some observations, both building on what my colleague John McTernan was saying in the previous panel, and then looking at what we can extract as pollsters. And we certainly don't want to be in the situation as pollsters where people shoot the messenger. We don't. Surprise, surprise. I don't think the messenger should be shot. And in fact, I think the messenger, even in 2016, mostly gave us a lot of pretty accurate information. But the problem, of course, and this was identified in the previous panel as well, is how do we interpret that information? What are we using it for? And then what do we use it for going forward? And that's what I think what we're going to get to over the course of this panel and the rest of the day. So, I'm going to talk mostly about, as listed on the program, sort of the perceived failures of polling in 2016, the most high profile of which, of course, internationally were the Brexit vote in the UK, and of course the election in the US, where the broad perception is polls got it wrong. They thought Brexit was going to lose and it won, and they thought Hillary Clinton was going to win and she lost. But I think what we're really observing in those two places is, and really in this more general observation that people have of, oh, the polls are wrong or the polls aren't doing what they're supposed to do, is a collision between human nature, which is that we want prediction and certainty. Somebody gives us a number, we want that number to tell us the future, right? The future is unknowable and unknown, and it's sometimes scary in that way. And sometimes a politician can be successful and say, let's go back to something we liked better many decades ago, or we think we liked better, because the future is scary and frightening. And we have that same tendency in looking at poll results. Okay, here's a result. It tells me something reassuring or something I wish to believe about the future. Therefore, I'm going to say that's a prediction and that it's certain, even though in reality it isn't, and the pollster is not saying that it is. And social science, of course, deals with probability and uncertainty, and it does not make actual predictions. And that there's a fundamental conflict in our brains between that desire for certainty and what we actually get. So, to underscore something that John said very clearly in the last panel, but it bears repeating because it is not actually what is being said most of the time in conversations with the media. And I had the similar conversation, like other pollsters, I had to answer a lot of questions from people over the holidays and after the election about what on earth went wrong. The polls in both of those cases were slightly wrong on average. They were slightly wrong consistently in one direction, which was a problem. And we need to understand that, and in the particulars of why that was, and those particulars there's some similarities and some differences between those countries. But the real error was in the analysis and in the certainty that was expressed, the level of certainty that was expressed about data that were clearly, when you look at them objectively, and I'm hopeful that we would be doing this now even if the outcomes had been less of a surprise, but nevertheless it's objectively true in that data. There was plenty of uncertainty available for anyone who wanted to see it. To their credit, and they were cited previously as well, and there are many aggregators and people who analyze data, but one of the best, I think, and still the one that deserves credit for the way they approached the data this year is 538 in the US, Nate Solver, who, to their credit, had more uncertainty in their model in the US election, saying that, and it was interesting that they had a model, and it was up until the notorious FBI letter that sort of changed the dynamic around Hillary Clinton in the last week. They had a 17% chance for Trump to win. After that letter, they had a growing chance for Trump to win, up to about 29% was their last estimate prior to Election Day, which is a pretty uncertain prediction, right? Something has a 29% chance of rain today. You might want to bring an umbrella. But nobody brought their umbrella to this election. And of course, there were other models that were more certain and said it was 90 or 95 or 98%. And I think those models were obviously deeply flawed. And part of their flaw was too great a degree of certainty applied to numbers that are inherently uncertain, that have certain, there's a certain amount of churn and chaos and change in the world that is not measurable in opinion surveys. And that level of certainty just shouldn't have been concluded. Likewise, in the Brexit, and this is not, Nate Silver did not have a forecast in the Brexit, but if you look at the final average of the polling in the Brexit vote, it was extremely close, and certainly the only reasonable conclusion was it's too close to call. The last average, and this is they're again different indexes, but one that I find reasonably credible, the Huffington Post average, had a 45.8% Remain vote, 45.3% Leave vote, and that may have been even completely accurate and still produced the result it did. It's just that you had 10% who didn't choose until the end, and they chose more to the Leave side. But even if it was a little bit off, and clearly, I think there were clearly some errors in one direction in that polling. Nobody should have gone into that election day saying it's a done deal, it's clear. They should have been saying it's very uncertain and it could go either way. So in the end, in the United States, just to be, again, reiterate, but just make very clear something about, just so we're focused on the right thing, right? Because there are some things that were not as good as they could have been and things we need to improve. Always that is true. But so they were focused on the right things. The polls in the United States about the popular vote for president were by and large accurate. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in the United States by over 2%. The average of the polls was, depending on which aggregator you look at, anywhere from her winning by 3 or 4%. That is very, very close, and is about as accurate as any set of polls have been in any previous U.S. presidential election. Well, now, they were off in the few states that were critically important. I'll talk about that. The UK Brexit, a little bit more off. Final polls were roughly even, wound up just under 4% advantage for the Leave side. So that's a modest error, certainly, but it is well within the sort of level of uncertainty that we should all apply when we're looking at any polling. The hardest part of polling, I think a part that's underappreciated in both in these particular errors or problems that we saw in 2016, is determining who will vote. And this is, it is a more arcane part of the process. It's not as easy to describe in a single number like the margin of error. Like, there's been some discussion of sample size. And certainly if you have the resources and you can take larger samples, if you do them right, they should be more representative and you have lower amount of error, and that's all good. But really, the difference between a 1,000 sample that has margin of error plus or minus 3%, and a 500 sample that has a margin of error plus or minus 4%, 4% is not, 4.5% is not that great. And certainly the larger poll is a little bit better, but that level of improvement is not really where the problem is. You can have a much greater problem in your sample, even if it's large, if you have mispredicted, and it is a prediction, about, when you're talking about an election poll, who is going to turn out and vote. And in democracies like the U.S. and most of them that do not have compulsory voting, so people are making a decision, not only a decision about who to vote for, but whether they're going to vote in that election. And they may decide to sit it out and say, I'm not interested in these candidates, I'm not going to vote this time. Or I'm excited by one of these candidates, I'll vote even though in the past I didn't. Do you know that in your poll the week before, the month before, what decision those people are going to make? You don't know it, you can model it. You can take all the information you have about who is likely to vote and model it as best you can. Most of the errors, I believe, in the US election and to some degree in the Brexit election were errors of turnout projection rather than measurement. We were measuring the vote more or less accurately, with one more exception that I'll mention, but that the turnout, who it was that turned out to vote, and it turned out in particular in the United States, and again, remembering that nationally the polls were basically right, and that Hillary Clinton got the most votes, as the polls predicted, in the 4 or 5 key swing states that most people thought Clinton would win, that Trump won. Most people in the end thought Trump would win Ohio, but it was a swing state early on. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. These are states where there was a higher turnout of what is now the Republican base vote in the United States, which is non-college educated, working class, white voters. They turned out at a higher rate than they had in previous elections, particularly in the rural areas, which was Trump's stronghold. And urban voters, particularly African American and younger voters, turned out at lower rates, generally, but particularly in those states, lower than they had historically, lower than they had 4 years previously in the election between Obama and Romney, much lower than in the election 8 years previously. And people were making, all of us, pollsters like myself, we were making assumptions about who would turn out to vote in those elections. And the best, historically, absolutely the best way to decide if somebody's going to vote is, did they vote in the past? A pretty good turnout model is to say, all right, you voted 8 years ago and you voted again 4 years ago, you're probably going to vote this time. And if you didn't, you're probably not going to. That's a pretty good turnout model. If you just did that, you got all of those states wrong. Because that's not who turned out. It was a little bit different who turned out in those states. A more sophisticated turnout model looks at what are some of the other factors that might be driving people to vote this year and more this year and less, they're more interested in voting this year, and some people who might be less interested in voting this year. And we tried, and certainly we weren't polling in those states, but in the states that we were polling in, we tried to compensate. And for instance, we assumed that African American turnout, the one of those states that I did a poll in was Michigan, and we did have Clinton slightly ahead, and it was essentially a tie in Michigan. We were just a couple of points off. But we did assume that African American turnout would be down. We did not assume quite enough of a surge in turnout in the rural white areas. And that was, we made what we think were reasonable assumptions about what was going to change, but they weren't quite right. They were a little bit off. And a little bit, in this case, was enough to swing that state. And of course, the way our system works in the US, it's state by state, it's not the national vote. So that's a critical piece. And likewise in the UK, and this is underappreciated in the UK, they had, for the Brexit vote, 72% turnout of voters across the UK. That is the previous general election, contested general election with all parties for parliament for who was going to govern the country, got 66% turnout. So if your model for who was going to turn out and vote in the Brexit had 66%, that was a pretty reasonable assumption about who was going to vote. And then you take your poll, and the poll shows, well, it's 50-50, 49-48. It's very close. You should have said it's very close, but there's error. And of course, if we're wrong about turnout, there may be more error. Well, they were wrong about turnout. And more people turned out to vote who were not expected to show, and more of those who turned out, who had not voted previously, were turning out for the leave. They were more, and that gets more to the values and the emotional part of politics that John McTernan was talking about. There was a greater sense of motivation on the leave side. And so was that measurable by polling? To some degree, yes. But if all you look at is the horse race number, it doesn't tell you that. You need to look beneath and look at the other things that are happening. So measuring turnout. And then, of course, there was, I believe, also in both of these cases, and this can be an issue in other countries where there is, and I think hopefully now across Europe and across the countries where we have these resurgent, people, you give them different labels, but populist, nationalist parties, anti-immigrant parties, and it's happening. Of course, I think everyone has woken up to the fact that these parties are serious, that they're going to be a major factor in elections. But to the extent people didn't quite believe it would happen in the UK or in the US, that people would respond to that kind of a message, it was seen as, again, among the chattering class and journalists, they didn't know anybody who would vote that way, so it was just beyond the sort of realm of understanding, and therefore they wrote about the data in the way that they could best understand it, which was it couldn't possibly happen. and then you have a phenomenon within polling itself, which is, they call it, the term was actually shy Tory. It was invented for British elections, which was Margaret Thatcher always slightly outperformed her polling because people were, that she was seen as not acceptable to the sort of chattering class, and therefore people were not, they didn't want to admit that they were voting for her. And of course we had that phenomenon, I believe, both in the Brexit vote and in the US. And it's measurable to some extent in the US. There's been just some initial studies of the differences between telephone polling, which is, to my mind, still better because of the quality of sample, but one drawback of telephone polling is you are telling another human being who you're going to vote for, and if you're embarrassed or you think it's not socially acceptable to give the answer you really believe, you might change that answer. And in fact, and this is actually true, not so much among the working class white voters, which were Trump's base, but the college-educated white voters, like most of the Americans who happen to be in this room, within that group, the online polling where they were anonymously stating their vote, not to another person, had the level of Trump support. If you look at the phone, the study I saw showed that with comparable samples, the telephone polls had the white college votes favoring Clinton by 21 points, the white college vote in the online samples favoring Clinton by 7 points. This is a certain group of battleground states they were looking at. But that's a significant and substantial difference and can account all by itself potentially for the error that was found in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which were the states that decided the election. So that's a phenomenon too, and that's on top of all the uncertainty and the other things I mentioned. So that's a lot of what's wrong, and I know we're running on time. So let me just say that there's more to say, and I'll talk more about the future. Obviously, the conclusion that all the polls were wrong is, I think, factually incorrect. But it's also dangerous. If the only takeaway from 2016 is polls are wrong, therefore you can't trust polls, therefore we should not do them, we're taking away an incredibly important tool for democracy to work. For there to be an ongoing sense of responsiveness and connection between leadership and the people, it can't just be every 4 or 5 years or at election time that you have that interaction. There has to be an ongoing dialogue, and polling is a critical part of that dialogue. And the vast majority of time, most of the high quality polling in these cases, in these countries and in the emerging democracies, it is more or less accurate. Yes, there are errors. Yes, there are things that are off by a few points here and there. Being off by a few points can matter if it's a referendum that's being decided by a few points, or if it's a national election that's being decided between two candidates by a few points. But it still matters, for instance, in the United States, that only 40% of the voters in the US approve of Trump today. Now that may be off. Maybe it's 44%, maybe it's 36%. It's somewhere around 40. It's not 60. He doesn't have 60% approval. He doesn't have 80% approval. And therefore, he should not claim he has the mandate to do certain things with the support of the people. He doesn't. And polling matters in order to make that point. So it's important for people to understand that and understand what they're looking at with polling. I'll stop there. Happy to continue after. Thank you.